Well, welcome to John Carroll University. It's so good to have you with us. My name is Ed Hammerberg, and I'm the Green Chair in Catholic Theology here at John Carroll. I teach in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies, and I welcome you on behalf of the department and the university. As many of you know, this is our second annual Theology for Teachers workshop. So last year was kind of a pilot. It was a great success, and everybody said, let's do it again. And this year we've grown. So we've got 91 teachers from 29 different Catholic high schools. 16 of those schools are here for the first time. We've got folks from the Diocese of Youngstown, Toledo, Cincinnati, Erie, Pittsburgh, Buffalo, and even the west side of Cleveland. Thank you for taking the time out of, I know, very busy days to be here. So for now, I would just like to introduce you to our first speaker, our keynote speaker, a speaker who's done a lot of thinking about and thinking with his students about how to reach them, how to ignite their minds and their hearts, how to draw them into this rich and robust tradition in a way that is transformative. Dr. Todd Walatka is the Assistant Chair for Graduate Studies in the Department of Theology at the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. His research focuses on the thought of Hans Urs von Balthasar and Latin American liberation theology, as well as pedagogical formation. He has, for example, published articles on hub and spoke student blogging and advantages for classroom discussion, uniting spirituality and theology, witnesses as theological sources. His recent book out this year is titled Von Balthasar and the Option for the Poor, Theodramatics in the Light of Liberation Theology. At Notre Dame, Todd teaches a course titled Teaching Theology, and he is deeply involved in Notre Dame's ECHO program, which prepares recent college grads to become catechists and teachers. When one of the participants at last year's Theology for Teacher workshop recommended inviting Todd, I thought, of course, why didn't I think of that? His remarks this morning are titled, Be Transformed by the Renewal of Your Mind. What are we trying to do in the classroom? Please join me in welcoming Dr. Todd Walatka.
All right, we're live. Thank you, Ed, for the invitation to speak and for that very kind introduction. One of my favorite courses to teach at Notre Dame is our Teaching Theology course. This is a course for folks going off to teach for the first time in high schools and some middle schools each summer. So I get sort of these 10 to 15 students, most of them going off for the first time, some of them having a couple years experience. And I sometimes joke, but only half joking, that course is my single greatest contribution to the kingdom of God. That if those students will go off and teach 2,000 students over the course of just that year. So if I can help them a little bit, it's only half joking because I have hope for my children that they will go on to do even greater things. The topic of my talk today, I'd like to talk about sort of teaching theology in a way that's transformative. And the title of the talk comes from Romans 12, verse 2. And I'd like to start here with a brief reflection on that verse. And at your table are handouts. And you'll see sort of a basic kind of the structure of my talk. So always good to tell the participants that there's handouts, yeah. So that I'm going to start off with this reflection on Romans 12. I'll talk a little bit then about evangelization, catechesis and theology, and then finally look at a little bit of work from Christian Smith, who's a sociologist at Notre Dame. So the title of my talk comes from Romans 12. I'd like to start by reflecting on this verse in Romans as a way of discussing the vocation of a theological educator. On your sheet, I've given you sort of Romans 1 to 2 right at the top. So let's just look at this together. So verse 1. I appeal to you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. This verse is oftentimes quoted by Christians. You see it on magnets and on people's walls and all sorts of other things. It's a great verse. But it's very easy to skip over the most important word in the verse. And that word is therefore. Romans 12 is the beginning of the final section of Paul's letter, a section which offers a series of exhortations to those who follow Christ. But these exhortations only make sense in the context of the letter as a whole. Paul is not urging his audience to a general sense of moral improvement. Instead, he's calling upon them to accept in faith and in deeds the wondrous gift of salvation given to us in Christ. The letter as a whole is an exposition of this gift of salvation. He begins with an account of human sin, our alienation from God, and how we are brought back into right relation to God, not through our own works, but rather through the free grace of God in Christ. The letter as a whole hinges upon the power of God's merciful love, and in particular on the cross as the center of God's salvific action on our behalf. And this love is not something of the past, but rather sustains, sanctifies, and gives peace to the followers of Christ. In chapter 8 of Romans, we find Paul's celebration of the inconceivable richness of God's love. If God is for us, who can be against us? I am convinced that neither death nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. And finally, immediately prior to our passage, Paul insists that God's love is universal, embracing both Jews and Gentiles. So we have the first 11 chapters of Romans. And then we get to this therefore of Romans 12. God's mercy and love have been freely and bountifully given to us. Therefore, we must offer ourselves back to God as living sacrifices. If we have experienced such mercy in our own lives, we must therefore, by God's grace, live in a new way. Our whole lives are to be an act of gratitude and worship, and this dedication of our lives is pleasing to God, acceptable to God, as it says in verse 1. Okay, so now let's look at verse 2. All right, we've made it halfway. Paul begins here with a juxtaposition of two ways of being. So he says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, so that you may prove what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. So we have these two ways of being. We can conform to the ways of the world, or we can be transformed by the renewal of our minds. So what does this exhortation, to be transformed by the renewal of our minds, mean? Minimally, and I'll aim for minimally here today. Okay, minimally, it means that the content of the faith, the love of God poured out in Christ, is transformative. If we truly come to know this love, our whole being, including our mind, will be transformed. We will be transformed in such a way that we cling to truth, we proclaim the truth, and we come to know the will of God, what is good, acceptable, and perfect. For my talk this morning, this reflection on Romans 12, 1-2, can be seen as an exhortation to each one of us who serves as a teacher, and as a vision for the sort of transformation that we desire for our students. Each one of us is called to recognize and celebrate the wondrous deeds of God, and therefore to offer our whole life back and be transformed by God's gracious mercy so as to see anew and live faithfully in the world. The acceptance of the love of God in both faith and practice, of course, is the goal of evangelization. And so here I want to turn to sort of the second part of the paper, sort of evangelization, catechesis, and theology. Pope Francis has emphasized that every baptized Christian is called to the task of evangelization, to the task of proclaiming the good news. However, theology teachers and catechists play particularly important roles within the evangelical mission of the church. I'm not going to try to parse out the minute differences between catechesis and theology here. I'm going to give a quick little definition of each, but more or less assume that there's enough overlap that we can use them interchangeably. When we're doing catechesis, we're proclaiming and teaching the faith with a particular intention. John Paul II describes catechesis as the process through which one's initial acceptance of the gospel is gradually deepened, developed in its implicit consequences, explained in language that appeals to reason, and is channeled towards Christian practice in the church in the world. Although we tend to think of this as a process for catechumens and for young people, properly understood, it is a lifelong process of formation and conversion. Catechesis is the lifelong process of the deepening of our faith. When we're doing theology, we're undertaking the task of faith-seeking understanding, to use St. Anselm's ancient definition. In theology, we explore the truth of God and all things in relation to God in the light of divine revelation and in dialogue with reason and human experience. We seek to understand the systematic interconnections between Christian beliefs and to critically engage diverse philosophical and scientific modes of inquiry in pursuit of a greater understanding of Christian truth. Catechesis and theology, therefore, are not identical, but neither are they entirely separate. Both have to do with evangelization. Both have to do in some way with the proclamation and acceptance of the word. And so, regardless of their differences, both have to do with the deepening of our understanding and commitment to God, to God's gift of salvation, and to our life as disciples of Christ. So, I want to suggest catechesis, theology, both of these are sort of forms of ministry of the word within evangelization. And of course, as you know as teachers, evangelization always occurs in particular times and places and is directed at particular people with particular questions and issues and challenges. And so I was talking with Ed last night. We were talking about sort of your first time teaching, and you've been memorizing all your content and you've been going over it, and then you get there the first day and there are like students, like actual students. And you then realize that their questions and their backgrounds and their assumptions are going to shape just as much, if not more, of what they get out of the course as what we can say, right? And so we have to take our audience deeply into account when we're thinking about evangelization. And so then in considering the task of catechesis theology with teaching high school students, we need to recognize their cultural situation with regards to sort of faith formation, sort of look at what the research tells us. And there are many good researchers out there who we can look at for guidance for work with adolescents. I've given you the kind of works at the bottom of the sheet and then some of my cite within on the quotes. Jim Heft, Sherry Waddell, Christian Smith, Charles Shelton, all these are great sort of kind of primers on adolescent spirituality and current research on adolescent development. Kenda Creasy-Dean's book, Almost Christian, represents the general research quite well and paints a rather bleak picture of our current state of affairs. In her research, even those teenagers who regularly go to church, and then I'm going to read the quote, the first quote in this section. So even those teenagers who regularly go to church, these are like, the group we would have great hopes for when they come into our class. They had no readily accessible faith vocabulary, few recognizable faith practices, and little ability to reflect on their lives religiously. They possessed virtually no religious language to either critique or construct a worldview informed by, much less infused with, Christian faith. It's worth sort of pausing over each of these sort of, negative moments or failures so that they lacked an accessible faith vocabulary. The kind of basic vocabulary of the Christian faith, right? Of sin and redemption, of justification, of sanctification, of resurrection of the body, of the communion of saints. Just basic Christian language was not their native tongue. It's not how they naturally spoke of their lives and actually of their religious experience. They had few recognizable faith practices. So whether this is regular prayer, participation in the sacraments, reading the Bible, praying the rosary, whatever these practices might be, their lives aren't filled with these sorts of practices. And they had little ability, makes sense, to reflect on their lives religiously. Basically, religious faith doesn't shape their core identity. When they try to ask the question, who am I? Right? What makes me me and what I want to be in the world? The faith, religion, didn't seem to come in as a central factor. And this is not just sort of Catholics, this is sort of across the board, teenagers in the United States. And so, given these three, then the second part of the quote makes perfect sense, right? So virtually, they had virtually no religious language to either critique or construct a worldview informed by, much less infused with, Christian faith. Much of what we'll talk about in sort of the second half is sort of aiming at that goal that Dean lays out here. If we take these negatives, we also then get sort of, I think in some sense, a nice positive vision for teaching theology, for doing catechesis. Right? So if they have no readily accessible faith vocabulary, I think part of what we're doing is we're trying to give them a sort of a faith vocabulary that they can use, that they become sort of native Christian speakers, if the analogy holds there. That they would have practices that sustain them, that they're able to actually reflect upon their own lives, and when they do so, they bring the faith into that self-reflection. I'll come back to another number of these points with Christian Smith's research in terms of Catholic young adults. Dean's first point on the need for a faith vocabulary raises the perpetual challenge of how and when to teach the doctrines of the faith. There's a few things that I think maybe turn off, high school students. We're going to learn about doctrine today, right? So when and how to teach doctrine. On the one hand, catechesis theology seeks transformation, not mere knowledge acquisition, right? And so the next quote on your sheet from Jared Deese, he says, catechesis, therefore, is not just the acceptance or even the understanding of an idea. It is the process by which we let ourselves be conformed into what the idea calls us to be. When catechesis gets a bad name, it's the opposite of this, right? When catechesis gets a bad name, I hear this, I'm in a university theology department. You hear very often, I do theology, not catechesis. And what that means is I don't just have students memorize facts. Now, I want to push back and say, well, that's not what catechists do either, or at least it's not what they should do, right? That catechesis, it's not just understanding an idea, it's actually letting that idea transform us, coming to sort of that deep knowledge, deep acceptance of it. And so it should be experiential, it should be transformative. But on the other hand, catechesis also must not be severed from the dogmatic core of Christian faith. So you can also go far off to the other extreme. I don't want my students simply to memorize what the Council of Chalcedon says. We're just going to do something experiential. But I think we need to sort of have this balance here, that catechesis should be transformative, experiential, but still should not be severed from the dogmatic core of the faith. Basically, from the first part of my presentation, we must not forget the therefore of Paul's exhortation, the whole first 11 chapters of Romans. Dogmatic teachings provide a normative conceptual framework for the Christian life, and it provides students with a language that helps them understand the faith. The challenge then is to teach doctrines in such a way that it might actually lead to a renewal of our minds. John Cavadini presents a vision of what this might look like. And so this is the next quote, the large quote on your handout here. The teaching of doctrine often gets a bad name because we conceive of it not as the handing on of formative mysteries, but as simply informative, as merely informational. We have to get beyond the teaching of doctrine as though it were mere information. Aren't all the basic doctrines of the church, those high up on the hierarchy of truths, doctrines of divine love, the doctrine of creation, of the Trinity, of the Incarnation, of the Holy Spirit, of the Church, and the communion of saints? These are all in some way attempts to express and specify the central mysteries of God's love. Otherwise, they would not be worth teaching. The core teachings of the church are meant as a proclamation of love. And they are meant, or they should then, form us in a new way of life. Take, for example, the teaching on the hypostatic union. So the teaching of Chalcedon. Jesus is one person, two natures. Okay, we could go on and on and on, right? Cavadini suggests, this is later on the same page, to know that Jesus is fully divine and fully human is not to know just another nifty atom of cosmic information, but to know an unimaginably deep mystery, the mystery of God's unreserved, absolutely unconditional love for us. It's information which is formative, which is transformative. Cavadini's insistence on the transformational character of doctrine, that if we truly get it, it should transform us. It reminds me of this famous story from the life of John Wesley. Wesley was an Anglican priest. He was one of the founders of the Methodist movement. And this is from the 1730s. And at this point, he had graduated from Oxford. He was an Anglican priest. He was known as a devout Christian. And he was being called upon to come to the Americas. So a bishop in the U.S. said, come work at one of my parishes, evangelize the people. And so Wesley was all excited, and he came over. He got on a ship to come over to the United States. And on the way to Georgia, the ship came into an incredibly powerful storm. Right? So the ship is rocking back and forth. The central mast of the ship breaks in two. And Wesley, who's actually the chaplain of the ship, is just terrified and fearing for his life. And this is all he can think about. The rest of the passengers, the sailors, everybody is terrified, fearful, and he's kind of first among them. And meanwhile, there's this group of Moravian brethren, these pietists. So if you know the history of pietism, these are pietists in the 1700s. They're sitting there in the midst of this, singing hymns to God. Just joyfully singing a praise to God in the midst of this storm. And Wesley, this clearly challenges his faith a bit. He gets off the boat. They made it to the Americas. And he gets there, and he starts talking to these Moravian brethren. He's like, whoa, how did you react in that way? And they turned back to him and they said, well, don't you know Christ? Don't you love Christ? And he says, yes. And he wrote in a letter after that he feared that those words were in vain. That he said yes, but he wasn't really sure. A couple years later, he was back in England. His ministry in the U.S. utterly failed. His congregation hated him, and he hated the congregation. And it was a departure that both sides were quite happy with. And so he's back in England, 1738, and he's, of all things, going to basically a society where there's a talk. Of all things, this is where his spiritual conversion is going to happen, at least one of them. And the speaker was reading from Luther's introduction to Romans. And he was reading this part about the way in which God's grace should transform us. And at that moment, Wesley says, I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did trust in Christ alone for salvation. An assurance was given me that he had taken away my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death. Okay, this is a rather dramatic story. But what I want to emphasize is sort of kind of the first major point of my talk this morning, this kind of first section, is that we have to teach theology with the goal of transformation in mind. Right? So Wesley sort of he understood the faith. He was trained at Oxford. He was preaching regularly. He went to a spiritual confessor and said, should I keep preaching? And the preacher said, yeah, maybe you will start to understand it more deeply. Just keep preaching. But he eventually came to this transformation, this true knowledge that, yes, the love of God, what it means for me, how it transforms my life. This is what he eventually came to. And so our presentation, when we're teaching of doctrines, of the Bible, of sacraments, of moral teachings, needs to be done in such a way that the love of God shines through. Our presentation of the gospel, of these teachings, has to have Paul's therefore in mind. The church's proclamation is never a call simply to intellectual assent. I mean, it is that. It is saying, I believe, I affirm. But rather, it's more than that. It's a call to respond with our whole being, to let ourselves be transformed by God's love. We must seek the renewal of our minds so that we and our students might see and live the truth more fully. I'd like now to turn to Christian Smith's research on Catholic teenagers and young adults, sort of with this kind of goal of transformation in mind. I think it's helpful to see what his research has learned. So Smith, most of this research is from the early 2000s. They did this study of teenagers in the United States of all kind of religious backgrounds and no religious background, and sort of traced them over a number of years, did lots of interviews. And so what I'm drawing upon here is his second or third book. I think it's the third book. It's the one on specifically on Catholic young adults. So it's from the first huge group of research they did. They then came back 5 years later and spoke to the Catholics who were teenagers in the first study to see where are they now. What are their religious beliefs like 5 years later, 6 years later? And so the quote I give you then under the Christian Smith part of your handout is his basic finding in terms of Catholic religiosity into young adulthood. And he says, the transition from teens to to adults, so think 17 to 22, something like that transition. The dominant religious trajectory is one of stability. Catholic young people may change individuals' behaviors or beliefs as they age, but most stay in roughly the same category of religiousness, from the teenage years to emerging adulthood. The religious experiences, beliefs, and status of Catholic teenagers are thus extremely consequential for the religious faith and practice 5 years later. I don't mean to put too much pressure on your work here. I probably don't need to add to it. You already know sort of the importance of these years in the lives of teens, and this research simply backs that up. Because in other words, it's teenage faith commitment which will be most predictive, or is most predictive, of whether or not the faith will have a central place for young adults as they're making some of the most consequential decisions in their life. I think of, when I'm working with 21 and 22-year-olds and the sorts of decisions they're making. Whether or not religious faith is central to that is largely determined by what happened up to age 17, right? Not just 13 to 17, but the whole time period. In unpacking this stability, Smith names 3 major factors which greatly influenced religious commitment of Catholic young adults, so kind of those early 20s. I'm going to spend a bit of time on the first one, most of my time on the second, and then just briefly mention the third. And I've given you all 3 here on the handout. So first, he talks about the presence of adult role models. Smith emphasizes this factor particularly strongly. And so he writes in his work, precious few Catholic youth become highly religious young adults without enjoying strong relational ties to religious adults. In nearly all cases, having close relational ties to faith is a necessary condition of becoming a strong Catholic emerging adult. Smith notes that such relationships, close relationships with a faithful religious adult, it's not going to guarantee later faith commitment. But without it, strong religious faith is unlikely. We sometimes call something like this, it's sort of a necessary but not sufficient cause, right? Without it, it's unlikely. With it, it's not guaranteed, but it's a necessary cause for something to happen. In other words, so what teenagers need with Smith's research, I think it's twofold. They need both mentors in the faith, close relationships with religious adults, and they need adult witnesses in the faith. Thinking back to my own life, I sort of asked myself, why did I maintain sort of Christian faith, Catholic faith, into my 20s? And I can basically say it was a youth minister, it was my brother, and a college professor. I can point to the mentoring I got from those 3 people that sort of sustained me sort of along the way. In addition to sort of other adults that I simply saw, like, living out their faith. Living the faith as an adult is something that people do, right? Like, just having that as an option that I can see. That's the sort of witness part. And so high school theology teachers, of course, you can't take up that sort of mentor role for every student that comes through your doors. I feel like as teachers, we can have close relationships with a few students who seek that out. We can certainly guide students to other kind of faith-filled adults in the school, in our parishes. But even if we can't take up that mentoring role, for 100 students a semester, we can minimally provide a strong witness of faith commitment for our students. And this witness has to be just as much in what we do as in what we say. Our love and our care for our students needs to sort of shine through in our acts as teachers. And in this sort of our love shining through, it reminds me of sort of Paul's reflection in 1 Corinthians 13, which we hear about half of all Catholic weddings, right? So if I speak in human and angelic tongues, but do not have love, I am a resounding gong or a clashing cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and comprehend all mysteries and all knowledge, if I have all faith so as to move mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. It's not good enough, as much as I wish it were as a theology professor. It's not good enough just to know a great deal about the faith, and even to be able to explain it clearly. If we think of what Paul's saying here, if I have all knowledge but do not have love, I am nothing. So our witness to the faith, yes, it's a witness of, I believe this, with full conviction, right, in teaching that. But it also has to do, of course, as you know, with how we interact with students, conveying the faith by means of our actions. Theology teachers may very well be among the few highly committed adult Catholics that some students encounter in their teenage years. Particularly those students who don't come from a home with parents who are deeply committed to the faith. You all, okay, again, sorry for the pressure. You all might be, again, among the few highly committed adult Catholics that these students really get to engage with. And so it's crucial that we see ourselves as witnesses to the faith in what we say and what we do in the classroom. Okay, so the second factor that Christian Smith emphasizes is internalized religious belief. The teenage years are a time of intense identity formation within human life. It's a time when people are figuring out who they are, what they want to be, what they stand for, what's going to guide their lives. And the question for us, I think, as teachers, is whether or not Christian faith is going to be a core part of that identity. Will teenagers have internalized the faith to such an extent that it informs their identity and fundamentally shapes the way they see and live in the world? I want to spend a bit of time here to talk about sort of what does this look like, and then how do we do it, just very briefly. So internalized religious belief then is the remedy of what this quotation from Dean, right? Because basically the quotation from Dean earlier is that they have not internalized religious belief. It's peripheral to their identity and to their existence. So internalized religious belief it's worldview forming, right? And it's, by definition, if it's internalized, it's self-reflective. So those two goods, right? It's going to be worldview forming and it's self-reflective if it's truly internalized. And so our aim, I know this is a high aim, right? Okay, should be that students would see and interpret the world in light of Christian faith, and that they do so in a self-conscious way. The importance of internalized religious belief also ties into another aspect of adolescent development. Oftentimes our students have a faith that's sometimes we'll encounter students whose faith is rather intense, highly committed, but it's maybe somewhat immature. That it's sort of like the seed that falls in the shallow soil in the Gospels. It sprouts quickly but then dries up. We have students who, over the course of adolescence, will naturally develop questions with regards to the faith. Their earlier conceptions of God, which were perfectly appropriate. I have a 10-year-old and she has a perfectly appropriate 10-year-old conception of God. But when she becomes 14, 15, 16, 17, new questions are going to arise, right? Her power for critical and abstract thinking is going to increase and develop. And one of the questions is going to be, does her conception of God keep up? Right? Does her commitment to the faith, does her conception of the faith, her understanding of the faith, keep up with the adult-like questions that she's going to start to ask? And so it's important to recognize that for teenagers, faith formation, this process of internalizing religious belief is usually marked by a bit of struggle. It's going to be marked by deep questioning. And that this is not, in and of itself, a bad thing. Right? It's hopefully a process of growth. It can actually be an immensely positive sign if the questions are genuine, if they're heartfelt. And so I think one of the things we have to do as theology teachers is to create a space where wrestling with these deep challenges is possible. And that it's a safe space. It's a space shaped by faith, infused by faith. And so hopefully students can sort of come out of those questions on the other side with greater sophistication and hopefully just as strong a commitment. Okay, so we're aiming at sort of, if we have internalized religious faith, this is, again, worldview forming. Right? It's self-reflective, and it's usually for teenagers going to involve some struggle along the way. In terms of pursuing these goals, in terms of like practical pedagogy, I basically, in terms of the time I have here, I want to give kind of one basic recommendation. And I'll give some examples of what I think this can look like. I don't think this is going to be earth-shattering for a group of veteran teachers. I hope that an emphasis on the very basics won't be too offensive. So the first thing I think we need to do, if we're aiming at internalized religious belief, is to name for ourselves and for our students precisely what we are aiming at in a particular course. What do we want students to learn deeply? What do we want them to internalize? I call this, for students who have gone through my teacher preparation stuff, they get tired of me saying this. We have to teach, I call this teaching teleologically, that a telos is our end or our goal, right? And we should have that directly in mind when we're teaching. And it should shape everything we're doing. This is what I want my students to reflect on. This is how I want them to be different at the end of this course. Whenever I'm teaching my own courses, I always ask myself, at the beginning, middle, and end, why do they need to know this? Why do they need to know this? Why do they need to know this? I just keep asking myself that question. How does this material relate to my core mission as an educator? How does this fit within my overarching vision for the class or for like my hopes and dreams for these students? Okay, I want to give you kind of 3 quick examples of what this might look like. The first one has to do with kind of the Christological Trinitarian controversies in the early church, that sort of dogmas on Trinity and Christology. This gets taught regularly in the bishop's framework, and it's a challenge to teach. I teach it at Notre Dame, as most of us do. And one time I was having a conversation with 2 high school theology teachers, and I was basically giving a similar talk to this, and one of the teachers was really excited to tell me about what he was doing in terms of teaching the early Christian controversies on Christ. And I was like, oh, great, like tell me. I'm always looking to, steal new things and take what you're doing and do it myself. And so he started going on, he's like, all right, my students are working hard. Like they're working hard. And I'm like, great, right? Like if they're not working hard, they're not going to internalize anything. You got to think. I'm like, okay, well, what do you got? He's like, we're going through 7 councils. They got to know the 7 heresies giving rise to each council. They got to know the Orthodox Christian thinker who opposed that heresy. They have to then know what the council taught. And he kept going and going and going. And the other teacher next to me, I don't know what was on my face. She was clearly sort of shocked, befuddled. I couldn't tell if her reaction was, am I supposed to be doing that? Or like, that's a terrible idea. I couldn't quite tell. But then she simply said, oh, what I try to do is to get them to think in a Chalcedonian way. So the Council of Chalcedon, where we get our teaching that Christ is fully human, fully divine, one person. This very basic teaching in our church. She says, my goal is that they would think in that way. That like when they think about Christ, they even if they forget the word Chalcedon, they just think in a Chalcedonian way. Right? Internalized religious belief. They're going to forget what Second Nicaea said. If I asked you all, like, what did Third Constantinople teach? Okay, some of you might know. I don't know. Okay, but most of us have no idea, right? But hopefully we think about Christ in a Chalcedonian way. Hopefully we actually think about Christ. We've internalized that dogmatic teaching in such a way that it shapes just our fundamental beliefs and how we live. Another example of this would be something like Catholic social teaching. Catholic social teaching is not my expertise. I hesitate to even talk about it in a room of people who teach it regularly. But I think it's important. Like, do we teach Catholic social teaching in a way that is likely to challenge standard ways of thinking about the world? Do we teach it in a way that students will really internalize it? There are, 7 principles of Catholic social teaching. Sometimes people list 12 principles of Catholic social teaching. Okay, there are lots of principles of Catholic social teaching. And it's very easy in a course like that then to they got to know the principles. And like that's the course, right? And they're going to apply it. They're going to discuss it. We're going to do great pedagogical things. My own take on this, when I've had the privilege of teaching Catholic social teaching, is I want them to internalize the ideas of human dignity and the common good. I'll ask them what subsidiarity is, and they got to give me a definition. That's fine. That's fine. They need to know some little basics. But what I really want is when they go into the world and they think about politics, that they actually think about the common good. That the common good so informs their worldview that when they think about taxes, private property, healthcare, whatever that issue might be, it's, well, where's the common good? What about the common good? Well, what about human dignity? We need to respect human dignity. I want those two issues to be deeply internalized in how they see the world and live their faith and just live their lives. And so that then means a certain, again, that's my telos, right? I got to define that really clearly. And it means other things are maybe going to fall away a little bit, right? But my goal is not just that they can spit back some facts to me, that they know the 7 principles, they can give it back, and they can even give an example. I mean, again, that stuff's all good. I have students memorize all sorts of things. I've had students memorize Bible passages. That's fine. But so that they can then have this sort of transformation in terms of how they think and live. Okay, one more quickly. Ecclesiology. At the core of the ecclesiology of Vatican II is the idea that the church is missionary by nature. John Paul II takes this up, Paul VI takes this up. And yet one of the findings in the research on teenagers is that very few think of the church in this way. Very few think of the church or their lives in terms of service to the kingdom or the call to holiness. But without this, our commitment to the church and to God will by definition miss something essential. To teach ecclesiology then means to give a fundamentally different vision of the church than is normative for most Christians today. Worldview forming, right? It's not good enough if students are able to memorize the marks, offices, and some aspects of the history of the church if they do not at a fundamental level see the church as an integral part of God's passionate love for the world. It's that fundamental reframing that I think we should be aiming at. If we want our students to internalize their religious beliefs, we need to articulate precisely what we hope this would look like, right? And then intensively shape our courses in light of that. We need to work teleologically. So this is sort of my most practical recommendation. The second one that I always give to my students is that this only happens by means of deep student engagement. I have all these little aphorisms I like to throw out with teaching. My favorite one, it's stolen. It's from Daniel Willingham. It's on the bottom of your sheet in terms of the book. He says that memory is the residue of thought. Memory is the residue of thought. We remember what we think about. And so if we want our students to remember something, we've got to get them thinking. Now, we might need to tell them something, right? We might need to say, here's something that you should think about. Right? We might need to lecture, get them to read, but then eventually we got to create the circumstances where they're going to be engaging and thinking and wrestling and being challenged by these ideas if we want that sort of deep learning to happen. Okay, on your sheet here I've given you Christian Smith's third principle or third marker of continued religious identity is practices. I'm just going to very briefly, like 30 seconds here. This is not to say, do not take this as like relative hierarchy of goods and what's important. Christian practices are incredibly important and they should be part of our teaching. Evangelization and faith formation should include Christian practice within the process. Students should be introduced to and invited to participate as much as they can in the sacraments, forms of prayer, service work, the study of the Bible, and other Christian practices. These practices, Smith says, it's key to long-term faith. Even when people start to hesitate intellectually, if they have these practices, sometimes it sustains them through periods of doubt. And also, practices are a way of almost carrying the content of the faith, right? So if we really get students to think in terms of human dignity, then there should be service work that gets paired with that. And as they then do service work, it should reinforce the content we've taught. Teaching the Trinity and just the sign of the cross. These kind of basic practices are key to they can be carriers even of the content, of like the dogmatic content of the faith, in addition to sort of their own good and sustaining faith and sustaining the faith life. Okay, so those are sort of Smith's three major points: adult role models, internalized religious belief, and Christian practices. Okay, just a brief conclusion. Teaching theology is a privileged form of proclaiming the good news, a proclamation that seeks, as Paul says, the transformation through the renewal of our mind. We must not lose sight of the place of catechesis and theology within the evangelizing mission of the church. When these are done well, a few things should happen. First, when we teach, we are offering a witness to the faith and what the life of faith and discipleship might look like. Our words and our actions should be a clear witness of the truth of Christ and Christ's love. Students should recognize that we're competent teachers, but even more so that we care deeply about each and every one of them as persons loved by God. Second, Teaching in general and teaching doctrine in particular should aim at transformation. And I'd like to sort of emphasize, this is not imposing something artificial upon sort of doctrinal teachings. The realization that God is love should be transformative. Right? So if we're teaching these doctrines right, it should be with that sort of transformation in mind. And third and finally, if we have proclaimed the gospel well, students will have a genuine decision to make. In Romans, Paul slowly, patiently, and rigorously works through the dynamics of salvation. But he doesn't stop there. He offers an account of the faith that demands a personal response. Our teaching of theology must do likewise. We should follow Paul's pattern in proclaiming the gospel in such a way that it invites a decision. Given what God has done in Christ, therefore, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. Therefore, be transformed by the renewal of your mind. Thank you. We have some time for questions. Fire away. Questions, snide remarks. Comments, points that have succeeded for you. Yeah.
First of all, thank you. I feel like I want to give you a hug right now. Hearing everything you had to say. I appreciated the way that you discussed kind of emphasizing their thinking process and the transformation that comes with that. You mentioned giving a safe space to wrestle, which I'm totally on board with. The practical reality at my school, and I'm willing to bet a lot of ours, the kids are there for the grades, to get a good grade, to get into a good college. So, do you have recommendations, or what do you teach your own students in terms of, that's often, in my opinion, unfortunately, the access point. What do we have to know for the test? What do we have to write on the paper? Are there ways you would recommend to kind of wrap that into the process of giving the grade to kind of get at them from that angle?
No, that's a great question. Notre Dame students are certainly no different in desire for grades. They have been trained well, they were mostly valedictorians, and grades are how you get success in life. That's their experience. I mean, there's no way around it, and I think there are ways to sort of harness it. That they hopefully will do some sort of minimal amount of work, minimal amount of thinking. If memory is the residue of thought, that can at least be some incentive. I mean, the dream is that students would long to know more simply because they long to know more. That's the intrinsic motivation. Meanwhile, we'll use our extrinsic coercion to get them going. And what I have found is sort of tasks trying to build them up. So something like human dignity. I'm going to try to get them initially to memorize a definition, and there's going to be a quiz. They'll do it. Then they're going to have to summarize it in their own words, and they're going to be graded on it. Then they're going to have to compare and contrast human dignity or two situations involving human dignity. I was reading a pedagogy book where it was going through all sorts of different practices that teachers can do to increase student learning, including like homework, giving feedback, and like the number one thing was compare and contrast activities. This was like the number one thing for increasing student learning. And it makes sense because you have to actually know both parts really well in order to do that successfully. So to then take that concept and have them wrestle with it in terms of compare and contrast, how would these either two concepts or two situations, and then have them more than sort of apply it. Work with situations that might be challenging in the end, to have them kind of wrestle with that. But it does mean some sort of final project, final reflection. I think particularly in the upper level courses that involve more kind of personal commitment and wrestling. It's much more difficult, as you know, when like a student kind of throws a question out in the middle of class. And then you have to sort of gauge to what extent is this like a deep question of faith, to what extent are they just simply throwing out a random question, and to what extent is this something for the group or individually. Minimally, I would always invite that student to talk individually, and so that way I can sort of gauge where are we at. But I think basically, I mean, it's about creating assignments that require more of students, and that It's not as if it's like there are no right or wrong answers. Like, no, like, the concept we're wrestling with is human dignity. You got to show that you understand the concept. But I'm going to be looking at how well do you apply it? How well do you think with it? How well can you, what would it mean to live in light of human dignity at our high school? What would it look like if you actually thought that your fellow classmates had human dignity? Right? You say you do, but what would it look like if you actually lived in that way? Right? This is what I mean. Like students, like we have these ideas, but how do we actually treat one another? I think of things like the sort of widespread use of pornography and all these sorts of things. We don't look at people, we don't think of others as actually having human dignity. Like, what would it mean to do that? And requiring students, yeah, it basically is, right? Here's the assignment, to do that sort of work.
Thank you.
So I'm from St. Anne's, and a lot of us have had to deal with these like standardized tests for, gauging and measuring how, for lack of better terms, how good we are at our job, teaching theology and catechizing and things. So, I don't know, I guess my question is, if there are there any measurable metrics for success of a high school theology teacher?
I mean, that's a great question. Yes, but I always hesitate whenever these things get intensely bureaucratized and centralized in terms of sort of all disciplines and how I think I think we as teachers, I'll just sort of keep it at our level in terms of like our own courses. We should at the end of a semester, like we need to figure out like, did that work, right? Was I successful, right? And so we can kind of reflect on our own experience, like, well, just how do I think it went? But ideally, we're looking at sort of final assignments that students are turning in, right? We're looking at, how they performed on tests, assuming those tests were well written and sort of an accurate reflection. And even if we have sort of more kind of affective or spiritual goals, like I want my students to deepen the prayer life of my students. We still need to come up with a way, whether it's through student self-reflections and sort of personal narratives, we need to figure out, like, have we done that? Not in the sense that, like, an accreditation officer is probably not going to be too happy in terms of, like, we're not going to have the quantifiable data that, yes, like, the prayer life of my students went from an 8 to a 9. Like, I don't even know what, but we still want to know, like, if that's our telos, like, I want to deepen the prayer life of our students, that better shape what we're doing in the course, right? It better not just sort of be a vague aspirational hope that doesn't exert force on the course. But then we also then want to at the end figure out, like, did what I did, was that effective? So I think I would sort of push back in terms of, like, think for your own course. What are you actually driving at? Articulate that for yourself. I think some of my worst moments in teaching were because I never actually articulated that. It was just simply like, I'm going to talk about this today. Right? Like, what am I actually doing? What do I actually want them to know, and how do I want them to be different at the end of this day, at the end of this course? Articulate that for yourself, and then figure out ways, were you successful? Where did it go well? Where could it be improved?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but you mentioned that Young Catholic America was one of Christian Smith's first pieces on Catholics in America.
Yeah.
That was spurred by research done specifically on and with Catholics. And since then, I'm presuming he's written more. And I'm also presuming that there could have been more research done. Yeah. So has he readdressed these three major factors in new ways since then?
So he's just starting like a whole brand new set of research studies. But like they're sort of like in the early stages. This research is sort of from around 2010. Is when the Catholic, so the earlier stuff started with teenagers in like 2005, 2006, I think is when Soul Searching came out. And so it's about 5-6 years later, the Catholic stuff. But I think, as far as I know, he still holds to these three things. And I think they sort of make intuitive sense as well. Other researchers have found similar ideas. One of the main pushbacks on Smith's research is sometimes he comes down particularly hard on parents and sort of the failure of parents. And certain researchers have pushed back on that as like a primary cause, but not on sort of like the need for
brilliant to the bishop's curriculum. One of the things that I've learned in the many years that I've taught, I teach at Bill Angelo St. Joseph High School. You do not have to finish the book in the year, because our kids need to know that you and I love them first. The curriculum is second to the formation of the kids. That's one of the big things that in the past 5 years, I have changed how I teach everything, because our kids are so different from even 20 years ago when I was teaching. They need to know that somebody loves them and cares about them. All that other stuff is second to that. So that's my spiel.
And to piggyback, when they know that is when they're most engaged and when you're able to teach them. That's right. Right.
You got it.
That adult role models. Yeah.
I want to go back to one of the quotes that you gave early about how essentially kids don't know what it means to be Christian anymore. We don't have the vocabulary. And it got me thinking too, though, that that's kind of true for us as adults as well. And I think we've maybe lost sense of that transformative aspect as well. So I was wondering if you had any kind of recommendations for us, whether within our theology departments or us as school communities, like how can we retrain ourselves as adults to see faith transformatively so that we're able to be that kind of messenger for our students as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of my favorite lines in the Creasy Dean book is she says, it's not that we have failed to pass on what we believe to our teenagers, it's that we've done way too good of a job. That like basically adults don't actually have this sort of language, and we've passed on what we actually think and believe, which is sort of this narrowing and weakened form of the faith. And so I think in terms of like as a group, I would think like actually a couple of these books I've sort of given you here in terms of the Jim Heft book, the Creasy Dean book, Sherry Waddell, these are all great books to sort of read as a group. That have a sense of kind of the pastoral side, but also some kind of theological richness to them in terms of kind of framing Christian faith. And so I think sort of sharing in that kind of experience and discussing is going to be helpful. I also think, different schools have different practices. I know ones I have experience with oftentimes are far too isolated in terms of the work of teachers. That we don't actually know what each other are doing. We may know that teacher is really good, but then have no idea what they're actually doing. And I think just simply sitting in to listen and learn can be a way of, okay, because I know that person is strong in the faith, and I know that they teach this material well. What does that look like to do it? Because it's something I always struggle with teaching. I think that can also be just a nice way forward. Yeah.
Just some thoughts on that. I think we as teachers and as witnesses, we have to take personal responsibility for our own transformation. And if we know that the encounter with Jesus Christ is what transforms us, if we haven't been transformed again, we're constantly in conversion. Conversion doesn't stop. We have that responsibility ourselves. So I think that we need to take that responsibility for being involved in a faith community, finding ways that we challenge ourselves to continue to grow in our relationship with Jesus so that we can witness that love in the classroom. Beyond that, we all know Jesus loves us, but we have to take that personal responsibility of what am I doing to grow my own faith, to grow my own relationship? Does that mean being involved in a Bible study or a small group faith sharing, or does that mean doing something within our faculty and staff at school or outside of school? Whatever that may be, to continue that transformation in ourselves so that we can continue witnessing that in the classroom. When we feel dry, I think is when our teaching is going to feel dry. That we have to take that personal responsibility and then teach our students that it's not necessarily going to be their best friend who's going to lead them to Christ. It might be, we being the witnesses and empowering them to then witness to others too. So I think that also can help us, because how else do we do it Jesus' 12 disciples couldn't do it by themselves. They needed their faith community. They needed to take responsibility too in being that. So that's just a thought that kind of came in.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really hate to cut this off, but please join me in